The nurse did not ask me the question. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the words, not the tone, the direction. She looked directly at my daughter while speaking. Does she still cook safely alone? She, not Mrs. Turner, not you, she. I sat on the examination table holding a blood pressure form while cold spread slowly through my chest. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper towels. Normal clinic room, normal afternoon. Yet suddenly I felt strangely absent inside it. Sandra answered before I could speak. She's mostly okay, but we've had a few incidents. Incidents. The word landed heavily inside my chest. Not mistakes, not accidents, incidents. I stared at my daughter slowly. What incidents? The nurse froze immediately. Not cruelty, not mockery, recognition. Too late, she realized I was fully listening. Sandra shifted awkwardly in the chair beside the wall. The toast fire. Fire, interesting word, not burned toast, not smoke, fire. I laughed softly, brokenly. I burned 2 slices of bread. The nurse smiled carefully now. The careful smiles frightened me most lately. We just ask these questions routinely. Routinely. Not because of me specifically. Because older adults apparently entered certain rooms already categorized as possible safety concerns. I folded the blood pressure form tighter in my hands. You asked my daughter whether I can still cook. Sandra reached toward my arm gently. I pulled away automatically. The hurt on her face appeared instantly. Not anger, devastation. Because finally she understood something too. Every protective interaction now carried traces of evaluation. That was the damage. The nurse cleared her throat softly. After 65, we usually assess home safety risks. Assess, interesting word, not discuss, not support, assess. I suddenly remembered another strange moment from months earlier. Sandra casually asking, "Do you still use the timer when cooking?" At the time I thought she worried about multitasking. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. She had already started evaluating kitchen safety. Then another memory surfaced. February. Smoke drifting lightly from the toaster because I answered the phone while breakfast cooked. Normal mistake. Human mistake, yet apparently even that now existed as evidence. I looked directly at the nurse. How exactly did burned toast become a medical concern? The room stayed completely still. Because somewhere deep down, everyone there already knew how ridiculous it sounded spoken aloud. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. The smoke alarm went off. The smoke alarm. There it was. One loud, dramatic detail capable of transforming ordinary human distraction into imagined danger. I stared at my daughter. So now strangers discuss whether I can safely use my own kitchen. We're just being cautious. Cautious. Again, always cautious. Never humiliating, never invasive, cautious. The nurse opened a clipboard slowly. We also ask about medication management, driving, and memory concerns. Memory concerns. Of course, everything always returned there eventually. Fear quietly expanding outward until every ordinary activity became part of cognitive assessment. Then, another horrifying realization surfaced. How long have these conversations been happening? Sandra hesitated too long. The silence answered before her mouth did. Cold spread painfully through my chest. Not one conversation. Not one appointment. Pattern. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra standing silently in my kitchen watching while I cooked soup. At the time I thought she wanted company. God help me, maybe she was observing. Every interaction suddenly rearranged itself differently. Not family concern, monitoring. The nurse flipped another page on the clipboard. Any issues leaving appliances on? Sandra opened her mouth immediately. I answered first. No, too fast, too sharp. The nurse looked startled. Sandra looked wounded. And suddenly I hated that too. Because lately even defending myself emotionally felt dangerous somehow. I lowered my voice carefully. I have cooked for 43 years. The nurse nodded sympathetically. Sympathetically. That frightened me instantly. Because somewhere deep down, sympathy had already started replacing trust. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke me. The neurologist said small household mistakes can sometimes be early warning signs. Neurologist again, always experts, always systems. Fear reinforced institutionally until ordinary human imperfection slowly becomes diagnostic. I stared down at the paper crinkling softly beneath my hands on the examination table. One burned breakfast, one ringing smoke detector, one difficult year after grief, and suddenly medical staff quietly started discussing whether I could safely exist inside my own kitchen. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For weeks, I whispered, I stopped cooking certain meals. Sandra looked up immediately. What? The complicated ones. The room stayed completely still, because there it was again, the real damage, not the nurse's question, self-restriction. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to shrink their own lives voluntarily. I stared toward the cabinets lining the examination room wall. I thought maybe I really was becoming forgetful because everyone reacted so strongly to one stupid toaster mistake. The nurse lowered her eyes instantly, not defensive, not clinical, ashamed. Because finally someone inside the system understood the actual consequence, not safety, psychological erosion. Then Sandra quietly said, "We were scared after Dad died." Richard again. Always Richard. My husband's death had quietly transformed every ordinary mistake afterward into possible evidence of collapse. I closed my eyes briefly while cold spread slowly through my chest. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. The nurse's question was not really about cooking. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way, my children had started describing me to the world as someone who might already be becoming unsafe to live like herself. The appointment continued after that. Blood pressure, medication review, routine questions. At least that was what the clinic called them, routine. Such a harmless word for something that can quietly rearrange how people see you forever. The nurse checked boxes on her clipboard while speaking mostly to Sandra instead of me. Any recent falls, changes in appetite, increased confusion at night, Sandra answered automatically. I sat 3 feet away listening to my own life translated into clinical language by other people. That was the humiliation, not concern itself, translation. The gradual process where older adults stop narrating their own experiences and become narrated by family instead. Then another question landed like ice water. Has she had any wandering incidents? Wandering, not walking, not driving, wandering. I looked sharply toward the nurse. What wandering incidents? Sandra froze immediately. Too late, again. The silence already answered everything. Then softly, the garden center, my chest tightened painfully. 2 months earlier, I spent nearly 3 hours walking through a nursery because I could not stop crying after seeing Richard's favorite roses. Normal grief, normal loneliness. Yet apparently that now existed in medical conversation as possible wandering behavior. I stared at my daughter. I went shopping for flowers. You didn't answer your phone. I was crying. You sounded disoriented afterward. There it was again. Disoriented, not emotional, not grieving, symptom language. Fear had quietly rewritten ordinary sadness into warning signs once more. The nurse shifted awkwardly beside the counter now. Not cruel, not judgmental. Careful, always careful lately. I folded my hands tightly together. How many things have you all reported about me? Sandra rubbed her forehead tiredly. Mom, no, my voice cracked slightly now. I want to know. The room stayed completely still, because somewhere deep down, she knew the real answer sounded horrifying aloud. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra casually asking, "Still cooking full meals for yourself?" At the time I thought she worried about nutrition. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. She had already started evaluating independence. Every ordinary conversation suddenly rearranged itself differently. Not connection, assessment. Then the nurse quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. Families usually notice functional decline first. Functional decline, interesting phrase, not stress, not aging, decline. I stared at her carefully. You're discussing me like a damaged appliance. The nurse's face drained instantly. Not anger, not defensiveness, recognition. Because finally, someone inside the system heard how dehumanizing the language actually sounded. Then Sandra whispered something even worse. The neurologist suggested we monitor kitchen safety more closely. Monitor kitchen safety, not support cooking, not spend time together, monitor. Fear had quietly transformed my kitchen into a risk environment. I suddenly remembered Sandra installing a louder smoke detector last month. At the time, I thought she worried about old wiring. God help me, maybe she worried about me instead. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. That's why you reorganized my stove knobs. Sandra looked startled. What? The stickers. Silence. Too much silence. Cold spread painfully through my chest. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra added tiny colored stickers beside oven settings to make things easier. At the time, I thought she was being overly organized. Now everything rearranged itself. No. They were orientation cues, like the labels on the photographs, like the tracker, like the notebook. Tiny systems quietly preparing for anticipated decline long before any actual diagnosis existed. I looked toward the nurse slowly. Did my daughter tell you about the stickers too? Sandra covered her mouth instantly. The answer sat visibly all over her face. Then another memory surfaced. Michael standing strangely close while I cooked pasta last Sunday. Watching, not helping, watching, I suddenly felt physically sick. How often do you all observe me cooking? Sandra cried softly now. We just pay attention. Pay attention. Interesting phrase, not monitor, not evaluate. Pay attention. Soft language wrapping around surveillance again. I stood slowly from the examination table because suddenly sitting there felt unbearable. Paper crinkled sharply beneath me. I stopped making Richard's pot roast recipe last month. Sandra looked up immediately. Why? Because it takes 3 hours. The room stayed completely still. I became afraid of forgetting something on the stove. There it was again, the deepest wound underneath everything, not medical questions, self-erasure. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to voluntarily abandon parts of their own lives before anyone explicitly takes them away. The nurse lowered her clipboard slowly. And for the first time since entering the room, she looked directly at me instead of Sandra. I'm sorry, she whispered. There it was, recognition, not policy, not procedure, human recognition. Because finally someone understood the actual consequence. Not safer cooking, smaller living. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that nearly broke me. The first time the smoke detector went off after Dad died, her voice shook. I thought maybe everything was starting to fall apart. There it was finally, the real terror underneath all of this. Not toast, loss, fear of watching one parent die and slowly becoming terrified the remaining parent might disappear next. That was what made forgiveness possible eventually. Not easy, but possible. I stared toward the clinic window, where rain slid softly down the glass outside. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not making ordinary mistakes. It is realizing how quickly the people who love you begin quietly building systems around those mistakes, because they are already emotionally rehearsing losing you someday. After the appointment, Sandra insisted on driving me home. I almost refused automatically, then realized something terrifying. I no longer knew whether refusing help would look independent or suspicious. That was the trap fear creates. Ordinary choices stop feeling ordinary once people begin evaluating your competence constantly. The drive happened mostly in silence. Rain moved softly across the windshield while Sandra gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Finally, she whispered, "You're angry." Angry, interesting word, not humiliated, not exhausted, angry. As though emotional pain itself already sounded disproportionate, I stared out the passenger window. The nurse asked if I could safely cook. Sandra exhaled shakily. She asks everyone those questions. No, I turned slowly toward her. She asked you. The silence afterward answered everything. because that was the real wound underneath all of it. Not the questions, the transfer of authority. Somewhere along the way, my children had quietly become more credible narrators of my life than I was. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, the pharmacist asking Michael, still helping with her medications. At the time, I thought he misunderstood something. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. People had already been briefed about me, not maliciously perhaps, but carefully enough that systems quietly shifted around me. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. How many doctors know about this? Sandra hesitated too long. The neurologist, your primary doctor, the clinic nurse practitioner. Cold spread slowly through my chest. And what exactly do they think is wrong with me? The room stayed completely still, except for windshield wipers moving rhythmically through rain. Finally, Sandra whispered, they think you're showing possible early signs. Possible early signs, interesting phrase, not diagnosed, not certain, possible. Fear survives beautifully inside possibility because no one can completely disprove it. I laughed softly, brokenly. One burned breakfast became possible cognitive decline. It wasn't just the toast. Always not just. Tiny moments collected together until ordinary humanity starts resembling evidence. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. I started writing down kitchen mistakes after the smoke alarm, writing them down. Of course, the notebook again. My life slowly transformed into documented behavioral patterns. I stared toward the rain-darkened street outside. What exactly counted as a kitchen mistake? Sandra lowered her eyes. Leaving cabinets open sometimes, forgetting ingredients, walking away during cooking. I closed my eyes briefly. Human things, all human things. Richard used to leave cabinet doors open constantly. Michael burned pasta twice in college. Claire forgot ingredients every Thanksgiving. No one tracked them, because middle-aged mistakes feel temporary, elderly mistakes become predictive. That was the terrifying difference. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. That's why you bought me the automatic kettle. Sandra froze instantly. There it was, confirmation. 3 months earlier, Sandra arrived with a new electric kettle that shut itself off automatically. At the time I thought she worried about convenience. God help me, she worried about safety. Every gift suddenly rearranged itself differently in hindsight. Not kindness, risk management. I stared directly at her. How long have all of you been preparing for me to decline? Tears filled her eyes immediately. We weren't preparing. No, I laughed softly again. Trackers, labels, notes, neurologists. Kitchen monitoring. The car went completely silent. Because spoken aloud, fear finally sounded visible. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke me. The first time you forgot the soup on the stove after Dad died, her voice cracked. I panicked so badly I couldn't sleep. Soup, I remembered instantly. One pot simmering too long while I cried in the bedroom after finding Richard's sweater in the closet. Normal grief, normal distraction. Yet apparently even that had become part of the case against my independence. I looked down at my trembling hands. For months, I whispered, I stopped making complicated recipes. Sandra looked up immediately. What? I became afraid of proving everyone right. The tears finally slipped fully down her face then, because finally she understood the actual damage underneath everything, not medical concern. Psychological shrinking. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to voluntarily abandon parts of themselves before anyone explicitly takes them away. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard cooking spaghetti while forgetting the sauce entirely once. Everyone laughed for years about it. No neurologists, no safety assessments. Because middle-aged distraction feels funny, elderly distraction becomes clinical. That was the cruel difference. When we finally reached my house, I stood beside the car for several seconds staring at the kitchen window above the sink. My kitchen. The place where I cooked birthdays and holidays and midnight soups during fevers and anniversary dinners for 4 decades. Yet suddenly, all I could think about was risk. Stoves, timers, mistakes. Sandra stepped beside me quietly. I'm sorry. There it was again, recognition, not procedure, not prevention, human recognition. I looked toward her slowly. You know what I miss most? She shook her head softly. Cooking without feeling observed. The sentence settled heavily between us, because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything. Not the nurse's question, the quiet loss of ordinary confidence. I suddenly realized something terrifying. For months now, every time I stepped into my own kitchen, part of me imagined invisible evaluations happening somewhere in the background. Would Sandra approve? Would Michael worry? Would this become another story for doctors? That was the real tragedy. Fear had already entered the room long before I did. Then Sandra whispered softly. I think we became so afraid of someday losing you, we stopped trusting the person still standing right in front of us. The rain moved softly around us while silence settled heavily between mother and daughter. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when you make mistakes. It is realizing how quickly ordinary human mistakes stop being treated like human mistakes. At all once fear convinces everyone they might mean something more. That evening, I stood in my kitchen for nearly 20 minutes without cooking anything. Just standing there, looking, the stove, the toaster, the kettle Sandra bought me. The brightly colored stickers beside the oven settings. Tiny things, yet suddenly every object carried invisible fear attached to it. That was the damage. Once people begin treating ordinary life like a safety assessment, familiar spaces stop feeling emotionally neutral. I opened a cabinet slowly, then froze. Inside the door, barely noticeable beneath the spice rack, was a handwritten note taped to the wood. Turn stove off. Check oven. Unplug toaster. My chest tightened instantly. No, 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 no. I stared at the note while cold spread slowly through my body. Not a shopping list. Not a reminder for guests. Instructions, like something taped inside a rehabilitation center apartment. Then another realization surfaced painfully. Sandra must have added this while I slept during one of her overnight visits. Quietly, secretly, the humiliation burned through me. I ripped the note down immediately. The tape peeled sharply from the cabinet door while tears blurred my vision. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra casually asking, "Did you remember to unplug the toaster?" At the time I thought she worried after the burned toast incident. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. She had already placed reminders inside my kitchen. Every conversation suddenly rearranged itself differently again. Not concern, monitoring. I sat heavily at the kitchen table while the crumpled note trembled slightly in my hand. Turn stove off. 43 years of cooking meals for a family reduced to instructional reminders hidden inside cabinets. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. How many other notes existed? I stood abruptly and opened drawers. Nothing, pantry cabinet, nothing, then beneath the sink another one. Check water temperature. The room tilted slightly around me. Water temperature. Not because I ever burned myself, not because anything happened. Preparation. Fear quietly rehearsing future decline before it arrived. I walked slowly through the kitchen opening cabinets mechanically now. And then I found the worst one. Inside the baking cabinet, tucked beside recipe books. If confused, call Sandra or Michael before cooking. The words hollowed me completely. If confused, not if sick, not if tired, confused. One word capable of reducing an entire lifetime of competence into anticipated instability. I sank slowly into a chair, because suddenly my legs would not hold me anymore. Then another realization surfaced. These notes were not only reminders, they were instructions for a future version of me my children already emotionally believed might arrive. That was the terrifying part, not concern itself, expectation. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard forgetting ingredients while cooking chili once and laughing. Well, guess we invented a new recipe. Everyone laughed. No one taped notes inside cabinets afterward. Because middle-aged mistakes feel charming, elderly mistakes become warning signs. That was the cruel difference. The front door opened quietly then. Sandra, of course. I did not even ask how she got inside because my spare key quietly existed everywhere now anyway. She froze the moment she saw the notes spread across the kitchen table. Not confusion. Terror. Real terror. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then softly, "You found them." Found them. Interesting phrase, not "I forgot about them." As though discovery itself had always been inevitable eventually. I held up the worst note slowly. If confused, call Sandra or Michael before cooking. What is this? Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Not defensive, not managerial, ashamed. We just wanted backups in place. Backups. Interesting word, not support, not love, backups. Like emergency systems waiting quietly for failure, I stared at my daughter. You turned my kitchen into preparation for cognitive collapse. The tears filled her eyes immediately. That's not fair. No, my voice cracked sharply now. You hid instructions inside cabinets in case I stopped understanding how to feed myself. The room stayed completely still. Because spoken aloud, fear finally sounded visible again. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke me. The neurologist said familiar prompts reduce panic later. Reduce panic later. Always later, the future version of me quietly invading the present again. I looked around the kitchen slowly. My kitchen, birthday cakes, holiday dinners, Richard dancing while washing dishes. Soup during fevers, coffee before sunrise. An entire life happened inside this room, yet somehow my children had quietly transformed it into a monitored risk environment. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For months, my voice shook slightly now. Every time I forgot something in here, I looked toward the notes. I wondered whether maybe you were right about me, Sandra cried softly then, because finally she understood the deepest wound underneath everything, not the reminders, self-doubt. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to question their own competence before questioning the people quietly preparing for their decline. Then another memory surfaced. Last month, stopping halfway through cooking stew because panic suddenly convinced me I forgot an ingredient. At the time, I blamed stress. Now I realize something worse. The fear itself had already entered the kitchen long before I started cooking. That was the real tragedy. Not aging, conditioning. I stared directly at Sandra, across the table, scattered with hidden instructions and emergency prompts. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The notes were never really about cooking safely. They were emotional rehearsal. My children quietly practicing for the day, they believed I might stop being fully myself while I was still standing right there making dinner. Sandra removed the notes herself that night, one by one. Slowly, like someone dismantling evidence from a crime scene she never meant to create. I sat silently at the kitchen table while she peeled tape from cabinet doors and folded each note carefully into a pile. Turn stove off. Check water temperature. If confused, call Sandra or Michael. Tiny scraps of anticipated decline. That was what they really were, not reminders, preparations. When Sandra reached the cabinet beside the refrigerator, she froze suddenly. What? She swallowed hard. There's another one. Cold spread slowly through my chest. She peeled the paper down carefully and stared at it for several seconds before handing it to me. If you forget a recipe, don't panic. Start with something simple. The words hollowed me completely. Don't panic. Not because I ever panicked before, not because I ever forgot recipes. Because somewhere inside Sandra's mind, she had already emotionally rehearsed comforting a future version of me through cognitive decline. I stared down at the note while tears blurred the handwriting. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. These notes were not written for the woman I currently was. They were written for the version my children feared might someday exist. And yet they placed them into my present life anyway. That was the cruelty of anticipatory caregiving. The future slowly contaminates the present. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, Sandra asking casually, "Do recipes ever feel overwhelming now?" At the time I laughed because I thought she meant emotionally after Richard's death. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, she was assessing cognitive load. Every ordinary conversation now rearranged itself again. Not connection, screening. Sandra sat slowly across from me after removing the last note. The kitchen looked normal again, at least physically. But once fear enters a room, nothing ever fully returns to innocence afterward. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that nearly broke me. The first time the smoke detector went off, her voice shook slightly. I imagined firefighters finding you confused and alone. There it was finally, the real terror underneath everything. Not toast, not kitchens, catastrophic imagination. Fear had quietly expanded one small mistake into entire future tragedies inside my children's minds. I folded the crumpled notes carefully together. For months, I whispered, I stopped baking. Sandra looked up immediately. What? Your father's birthday cake recipe. The room stayed completely still. Why? Because it has too many steps. The tears finally slipped fully down her face then, because finally she understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not safer cooking, smaller living. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to voluntarily abandon the parts of life that make them feel most themselves. Then another memory surfaced. Richard burning an entire tray of garlic bread during Christmas dinner once. Everyone laughed for years about it. No neurologists, no kitchen assessments, no hidden notes. Because middle-aged mistakes feel funny, elderly mistakes become predictive. That was the terrifying difference. I looked slowly around the kitchen. The blue ceramic bowl Richard bought in Vermont. The worn wooden spoon from our first apartment. Coffee stains near the old recipe shelf. An entire marriage lived inside this room, yet somehow all my children could see lately was risk. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The notes weren't really for me, were they? Sandra blinked through tears. What? They were for you. The sentence settled heavily through the room. Not memory support, emotional reassurance. The notes helped Sandra believe she could control future fear somehow. That was why they existed, not because I needed them. Because uncertainty terrified my children more than surveillance did. Then Sandra whispered softly, I think I became obsessed with preventing disaster. Obsessed. Interesting word. Not concerned. Not cautious. Obsessed. Perfect honesty at last. Fear had quietly transformed my daughter from loving family into someone constantly scanning ordinary life for signs of future collapse. I reached toward the pile of notes slowly. These changed how I saw myself. Sandra covered her mouth instantly, not guilt, recognition. Because finally she understood the deepest wound underneath everything, not the reminders themselves. Identity distortion. For months, every forgotten ingredient or distracted moment inside the kitchen became private evidence against myself before I ever questioned anyone else. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing in the grocery store 2 weeks earlier staring at recipe ingredients, while panic suddenly convinced me I was forgetting something important. At the time I thought stress. Now I realized something worse. I had already internalized everyone else's fear. That was the real tragedy. Not aging, psychological conditioning. Sandra wiped tears from her face shakily. The neurologist said preparation reduces family trauma later. Family trauma later, always later. Future pain quietly justifying present humiliation. I stared toward the stove while silence settled heavily through the kitchen, then quietly asked, Do you know what I miss most? Sandra shook her head softly. Cooking without feeling evaluated. The sentence hung between us painfully, because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything. The quiet loss of ordinary confidence, not in memory. In humanity, I suddenly realized something terrifying. For months now, every time I entered my own kitchen, part of me subconsciously imagined invisible observers asking whether I still seemed competent enough to be there. That was the true damage fear creates, not restrictions, performance. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke my heart. I think we became so afraid of someday taking care of you, we stopped seeing how capable you still were right now. The words settled heavily across the quiet kitchen. Because finally, maybe for the first time, my daughter understood the actual tragedy underneath all of this. Not the smoke detector, not the hidden notes. The gradual emotional shrinking that begins when older adults stop being trusted to simply live imperfectly like every other human being alive. The following Sunday, I decided to cook a full dinner. Not because anyone asked me to, because fear had already taken enough from my kitchen. I woke early and pulled Richard's old birthday cake recipe from the drawer beside the stove. 3 pages. Coffee stains, his handwriting in the margins correcting my frosting measurements from 20 years ago. Normal recipe, normal memory, yet my hands still shook slightly unfolding it. That was the damage. Once people begin treating ordinary life like evidence of decline, even familiar rituals start feeling like tests. I stood in the kitchen for several long seconds just breathing. No hidden notes now, no labels, no emergency prompts taped inside cabinets. Still, part of me kept expecting to find them, invisible fear lingering long after paper disappears. Then another realization surfaced slowly. I was no longer only cooking dinner. I was proving something. That terrified me, because ordinary life should never feel like performance. Yet for months now, every simple task had quietly become loaded with imagined evaluation. I started chopping vegetables carefully. Too carefully, measuring ingredients twice. Checking oven knobs repeatedly. Watching timers obsessively, not because I needed help, because I had started monitoring myself through everyone else's fear. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard dancing terribly beside the stove while burning onions during our first Christmas together. Everyone laughed. No one documented it, because middle-aged imperfection feels lovable. Elderly imperfection becomes suspicious. That was the cruel difference. Halfway through preparing the sauce, Sandra arrived unexpectedly with Ethan. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, I saw it. The automatic scan, stove on, timers set, counters organized, observation, not even intentional anymore. Instinct. Sandra caught herself almost immediately. Too late, I already saw it. The recognition devastated her instantly. I'm sorry. There it was again. Recognition, not procedure, not concern, recognition. I stirred the sauce slowly without turning around. For what? For checking. The kitchen stayed completely still, because finally the thing itself had become visible spoken aloud. Not helping, checking. Then Ethan ran into the room carrying his baseball glove. Grandma, something smells weird. I laughed automatically. So did your grandfather's cooking half the time. Normal moment, normal joke. Yet Sandra visibly relaxed the second I laughed, instead of becoming confused or flustered. That was the tragedy. Even my emotional reactions had quietly become reassuring or alarming indicators inside other people's minds. I suddenly realized something terrifying. My family no longer simply experienced moments with me, they interpreted them. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, forgetting whether I added salt already while making soup. At the time, I quietly threw the soup away afterward because panic convinced me it proved something terrible. God help me. I had already started hiding ordinary mistakes. That was the real danger of constant evaluation, not judgment, shame. I looked toward Sandra carefully. For months, I stopped feeling human in this room. The tears filled her eyes immediately. Because finally she understood the true damage underneath everything. Not fear itself, dehumanization through caution. I turned off the stove and faced her fully for the first time. Do you know what healthy people do when they burn toast? Sandra shook her head weakly. They laugh. The room stayed completely still. Do you know what frightened people do? Silence. They start imagining neurologists. The tears slipped fully down Sandra's face then, because there it was, perfect truth. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary imperfection into catastrophic symbolism. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The smoke detector scared you because Dad had just died. Sandra nodded immediately, not because toast mattered, because grief magnifies vulnerability everywhere afterward. I softened slightly then. Because finally, I understood something too. My children were not really preparing for dementia. They were emotionally drowning after losing one parent and desperately trying to control the possibility of losing the other. That did not erase the damage, but it explained it. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke my heart. I think after Dad died, every mistake started feeling permanent. Permanent. Interesting word. Not temporary, not human, permanent. Fear had quietly stolen proportion from my children. One burned breakfast no longer stayed one burned breakfast. It became possible beginning. Then another memory surfaced. Richard forgetting our anniversary once and buying flowers 3 days later while laughing. I'm lucky you married an idiot. No panic. No assessments. No hidden cabinet notes. Because middle-aged forgetfulness feels forgivable, elderly forgetfulness becomes predictive. That was the cruel difference. Dinner finished cooking while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows again. Always rain lately. We ate slowly, quietly. No one monitored whether I remembered ingredients. No one checked timers. No one corrected anything. Just dinner. For the first time in months, my kitchen briefly felt like a kitchen again instead of a risk environment. After dessert, Ethan asked if I would bake his birthday cake next month. For one horrible second, fear flashed through me automatically. Too many steps, too much pressure, too much room for mistakes. Then I looked toward Richard's recipe card resting beside the stove, and suddenly something inside me loosened quietly. Yes, I whispered, just yes. No performance, no proving, just life continuing. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone beside the darkened kitchen counter, listening to the refrigerator hum softly in the silence. No hidden notes, no observation, no evaluations. Just me, still here, still cooking, still human, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when you make ordinary mistakes. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform those mistakes into imagined evidence of future disappearance. One burned breakfast, one forgotten ingredient, one difficult season after grief. Tiny moments repeated emotionally until the people who love you stop simply sharing your life and start silently preparing for the day they think you might no longer fully belong inside it.